This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they start to believe in everything. And I think Jamie Cawley would probably agree with that because he's written a book called Beliefs and the World They Have Created. And it's pretty much what it does. It does what it says on the tin. I think Jamie you're in Shanghai, aren't you, Jamie? I hope you're joining me.
42 floors up in Shanghai. Yes, here I am.
Well, most people will assume that when you talk about beliefs, you mean religious beliefs, but you have a much wider view of what a belief is. So I'm going to start by asking you, what is your definition of a belief system?
Well, a belief system has to be centered on a faith. And that a faith means believing something to be true because of conviction, because you insert this is true, not because there's evidence for it. So, for example, in Christianity, you believe that Jesus is the Son of God as a matter of conviction. And if you're a communist, you believe that there's a force to history that means that the proletarian revolution is inevitable. And so it is with the other modern beliefs of nationalism, where you believe that people are somehow different from different nations, and environmentalism, where you believe that the activities of the world, of humanity, will inevitably bring future problems. And these are convictions held because you're convinced of them, not because of evidence. And that makes a belief.
You suggest that the default belief of mankind before we get into much of civilization and sometimes afterwards is polytheism, and you see that a typical pattern across the world, don't you?
Well, very much so. It is extraordinary that cultures and civilizations and tribes and peoples who have no contact with each other nevertheless believe in invisible human-like beings with magic powers who can be persuaded to work on your behalf. And they can be persuaded by either prayer or actually much more effectively by sacrifice. And this same belief has been held by all people until, roughly speaking, the arrival of literacy. And it's a very simple way in which you can remove from the world the terrible fear that it's all pointless, because the reason why things happen is because the godlets, the invisible beings, have made them happen. And you can influence them. And this seems to be necessary almost for us all to believe.
You use the word godlet there, and it's not quite a coining of yours, but when you say that, you mean gods, but gods as distinguished from the Christian or the Jewish God.
Yeah,
the
gods with a small g, not gods with a big G. But I think it's rather confusing to talk about gods and, the god of this and the god of that, and then talk about God. So I've used the word godlets just to make the distinction.
You mentioned literacy, and it does seem to be literacy that moves people on from polytheism to other systems of belief. And why is that?
Well, it's very difficult to be sure, but what seems to happen is that people don't seem to talk about the right and wrong and the meaning of life and what it is to live a good life, which is the subjects of all of the other religions, without writing about it. I mean, I presume they may have done so, but they didn't form systems without writing. And that's where we see the introduction of the other religions, is when writing comes in and starts talking about those key factors that we now see as religious.
Well, we have all these other systems of belief, but we're going to start off talking about religious beliefs because I think that's what people would expect when they picked up the book. It's what I expected, and I was pleasantly surprised how intrigued I was in what you had to say afterwards. But let's start off talking about, in particular, one aspect of the monotheistic religions, which is the way that polytheism creeps back in again. You suggest that, for instance, in medieval Christianity, it was substantially polytheistic. Can you develop that for me?
Well, yes, it returned with the decline of literacy. And of course, it was not only that people couldn't read, but in order to be Christian, you had to be able to read Latin, which was scarce indeed. So that people reverted back, it seems, and all the previous godlets became saints, and you had to do the same things. You had to sacrifice things. You had to burn a very expensive candle, and they were very expensive in those days. And we see the same thing in Christianity, and you saw it in medieval Islam, and you see it in Mahayana Buddhism, which is when literacy declines, people revert to the same system of there's someone with an invisible power, and I can ask them to help me to do things.
Now, it's characteristic of systems of belief that people who subscribe to them would bridle if they heard you say this, wouldn't they? You know, anybody when you challenge their shibboleths, they're going to go, "Oh no, it's very, very different. Our belief does not conform to this description at all."
Well, I've been very intrigued. I mean, so far, I've had a reaction from a number of religious people, and they have been, I have to say, somewhat to my surprise, remarkably tolerant and understanding, and said, yes, you describe what is, and you don't sit in judgment on us, which surprises me, because, I mean, the nub of the matter is that, you know, there are terrible things that have been done in the name of Christianity, and there have been terrible things that are done in the name of Judaism, and, you know, rather notoriously at the moment in the name of Islam. But that does not reflect on the faith, on the belief as a whole. And I hope I make that clear.
Oh, I think you do. This is the moment then at which we have to extend our understanding of belief to the other kinds of beliefs that you deal with. For instance, nationalism. I think you mentioned communism. There's a chapter on communism, one on environmentalism. Let's take. Let's take nationalism, because I think people will be surprised to hear your views on nationalism as a belief system that depends on faith rather than an apprehension of the way the world is.
Well, I think they will be surprised, but they will also be surprised to know that it's an academic commonplace. Ever since a guy called Benedict Anderson wrote his book called Imaginary Communities in 1983, pointing out that nationalism was something that was being created, people have come to realize that nationalism isn't a way of being, it's actually a belief, and a belief that has a definite start date.
I mean, you date the beginning of it, the invention of nationalism, pretty exactly to 1793 in Paris. That's specific.
Well, it is, but if you think about it, there is no nation state before the French Revolution. That is to say, a state with one language and one political rule, with the exception of Japan. The nation state is a creation of nationalism. It's when they bumped off the king, and therefore they no longer had the royal rule, the divine right of kings, they then had to say, well, what is it that we're fighting for? Because they had to fight, because they were being attacked by the Austrians and the Prussians and the English. And they came up with this idea of the France, of the French, of the citoyenne, of the citizen of France, and this idea that somehow or other that the French were a different group, and that they were nationalists. And they created everything. They created the first national anthem, the Marseillaise. I mean, the British national anthem is older, but it only talks about God Save the King. It's nothing to do with the nation. So this idea of the nation suddenly appeared, and it rescued the French Revolution and gave them something to fight for.
So you think I'm actually wrong in my opinion that the Welsh language should be ruthlessly suppressed? Then the notion of building a nation is not a normal human thing.
Well, we're rather lucky in the United Kingdom because we have defined ourselves as not being a nation. There's the nation of the English, perhaps, and the nation of the Scots, and the nation of the Welsh, but I mean that we've created a bit of. But we are fortunate that we don't have a nation state. We have a United Kingdom which is really an island, with plus of course Northern Ireland. So yes, it is an absurd creation that arose in the French Revolution, and that was then brought to everyone else. The national flag, for example, all that. This idea that somehow or other there's something distinctive about being French that makes you a Frenchman as opposed to, say, a Belgian. I mean, the French didn't speak one language. The Basques didn't speak French, and the Bretons didn't speak French, and the Flemings didn't speak French. And indeed, the French mostly didn't speak French. They spoke Occitan. And so this idea of the nation is created by nationalism. And
you take great pleasure in pointing out that, for instance, Garibaldi was born in France, and Ataturk was born in Greece. Well, all these nation builders were not members of the nations they built.
Well, indeed, and Greece is a wonderful example of a nation that simply didn't exist. I mean, apart from that, it was called Hellas, but the area, it was a kind of tribe, a culture. Greek was. I mean, there was no country ever called Greece or Hellas. There were a number of provinces ever in the whole of history, and it was created by a number of Russians who, after the French had broadcast the idea of nationalism, they thought that there should be a Greek nation. And it was they that impressed it on the warlords of Epirus and Peloponnesus to turn around and suddenly stab their Muslim neighbors who'd suddenly stopped being Muslim and become Turkish. And from there, the awful and bloody history of Greek nationalism arose.
Well, I'll tell you, Jamie, I liked your book very much when it was stroking my prejudices, which it did in the chapters about religions. And I liked it just as much when it was challenging them, and which you do in the later chapters, nationalism, communism, environmentalism. And we will come to environmentalism because it's going to be one of those incendiary points. But before we do, I noticed that you didn't include it as a system of belief, the sort of neocon attachment to free markets, and that's where I started going, hang on a minute, does this man really know what he's doing? I mean, why is communism a belief, whereas free market faith is not?
Well, the principal distinction is that the belief in free markets, and I'm not saying it's absolute and pure or anything like that, the belief in free markets is a belief in the markets are the best way of achieving an end, of achieving a well-being. And it's this idea that there's no other way will deliver wealth to people better. But that's not a belief in that comes from faith in the idea. It's a belief that comes from plumb ignorance. We don't know how markets work.
I like the distinction.
Well, it is. I mean, one day maybe we will know what the best way of distributing wealth is, or maximizing material well-being. But we don't now. And there are people who say, well, this is where we think it must be the best way because it enables people to make their own choices. But it is not about the faith is there in that free markets work, but it's a faith based on simply the fact that we don't know and we can't know. And I have to say that the more you look at it, the more rumpty-too some aspects of it become, because what is a free market when you've got a government contract and so on and so forth. So it's not a faith that exists on its own. It's a faith that exists in the absence of evidence.
Well, that sort of brings us on to environmentalism, which is not quite your final chapter, but it's the sort of the final peak that you scale, and that people will find controversial, won't they? You sort of see climate change as a kind of Pascal's wager, where people are just saying this would be it's better to pretend that it's true, just in case it is. Well,
it's a belief because the one scientific thing you can say about weather, which is climate, and climate is just long-term weather, is that we don't know what it's going to be, and we don't know what affects it, and we can't predict it. Now, if therefore you think it's going to get warmer in the future, that is simply a matter of belief. You believe it will get warmer in the future. There can be no more to it than that.
Well, I believe that the sun is going to rise tomorrow as well. Is that just a question of faith?
No, because that you can. I mean, to some extent, obviously it is, but it's predictable on the basis of past performance and of a model of the sun's behaviour that has worked continuously over a very long period. Now, we'd have no model of the weather that has worked over any period more than a couple of days. So we simply don't know what it's going to be. So that is an important distinction. It's a matter of belief whether in future it's going to get hotter or colder.
I've got two more questions. The first is, of the beliefs that you've studied here in this book, do you have an opinion about which is the most pernicious?
Well, the one that's killed most people most recently is nationalism. The First World War is a paradigm example. I mean, even now we can't, because we kind of don't acknowledge nationalism as a belief, we don't really know why we fought it. And all those people were killed for reasons that's extremely unobvious 100 years later. It is because we believed that somehow we were different to the Germans and the French and so on. So we had to fight for our own nation state. So it's the one that continues to kill people. It is the one that you're allowed to still spout aggressively and not be condemned. If you spout aggressive Islam, people will despise you. If you shout aggressive nationalism, people will still respect you, and I think that's pernicious.
Well, your last question, I can't decide whether to ask you whether you have any strongly held beliefs, or whether you think there are any beliefs that are legitimate to hold. So you can choose which of those to answer, and you can finish up with however you like.
Well, there is a belief which is a scientific belief, which is held by people like Richard Dawkins with evangelical fervour, and I hold with much less fervour. But is nevertheless, the belief is that the world is ultimately comprehensible to us, and with a secondary belief that understanding that world will enable us to benefit and improve ourselves and our lives. Now, there is no reason, there's no scientific test or anything to suggest that can support the idea that we can understand the world. I mean, it's done fairly well in bits of the world and still not in others, like for example, the future of the weather. But that is a belief which, on the whole, I tend to think I support, and I think many people do.
Well, as long as you have faith, Jamie, that's enough. Your book is called Beliefs and the World They've Created. I think it'll be found under the religion shelves in the bookshops, which seems a bit narrow. It's published by Matador at $9.99. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you very much. It's been great fun.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Hague. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.